Ethan thought he had moved on, healing from the pain of being left behind. But when his ex returns, asking for another chance, he's torn. Should he forgive her and take a risk on love again, or stay true to the one who helped him through it all? We are about to find out what happened in this story, but if you like stories like this one, don't forget to like and subscribe. After the breakup, Ethan found himself in a strange limbo. It had been almost a year since the end of his relationship with Sophie, yet some wounds still felt fresh, raw in a way that only time could dull. She hadn't just been his girlfriend of 3 years, she'd been the person he thought he'd spend his life with, until, of course, she left him for his best friend, Marcus. Ethan still couldn't wrap his mind around it, even after all these months. Losing both of them at once felt like his world had collapsed in a single, unexpected blow. One night, they were all out laughing and talking over drinks. The next, he was blindsided, alone in his small apartment with nothing but their betrayal for company. Life had slowly started to make sense again, though. Therapy helped, giving him a space to make sense of things without the anger clouding his judgment. He'd started picking up old hobbies he had abandoned, rediscovering his love for photography, and spending weekends at the dog park with Milo, his golden retriever, who had become his most loyal companion. In fact, he found a certain strength in the routines he built for himself, as if reclaiming the spaces where Sophie and Marcus had once held sway. Little by little, he was getting used to a new normal. He kept his friendships tight, too, learning to lean on people who showed him what genuine support looked like. New faces, old high school friends he hadn't spoken to in years, he found a surprising mix of comfort and camaraderie among them. Yet, beneath it all, there was still a small, hidden part of him that couldn't help but wonder why they had done it. Sometimes, he'd catch himself trying to decipher the why, playing old conversations over in his mind, analyzing tiny details as if he'd missed something crucial all those years. But lately, he was moving forward. He rarely thought about her, and when he did, the sting was less. He was rebuilding, albeit slowly. Friends mentioned he even seemed lighter. Little did he know, his past was about to resurface, and Sophie would re-enter his life with a sincerity he couldn't ignore or entirely trust. Ethan's phone buzzed late one evening while he was unwinding with a book and a mug of chamomile tea. He didn't expect anyone to be texting him, most of his friends knew this was his downtime. Milo was curled up beside him, snoring softly. When Ethan glanced at his screen, his heart skipped. "Sophie, hey! Long time. Can we talk?" Ethan stared at the message, feeling an old familiar tightness in his chest. It had been nearly a year since Sophie had left him for Marcus, his best friend since middle school, the guy who'd stood by him through breakups, late-night study sessions, first jobs, and first apartments. But Marcus had also been the one Sophie chose over him, shattering Ethan's trust and leaving him with a wound he'd thought would never close. He had managed to get this far by working through the pain on his own, finally beginning to feel whole again. And now, here she was, reaching out. He debated ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of him. "Ethan, this is unexpected." "What's up?" Her response was almost immediate, as if she'd been waiting for him to reply. "Sophie, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from. But I'd really like to talk. Face to face." "I owe you that." Ethan's first instinct was to refuse. He'd spent too long building walls around the parts of his life that had involved Sophie and Marcus, and now she wanted to bulldoze through them. But a part of him, however small, wanted to hear what she had to say. Maybe he'd finally get an answer to that haunting question of why. The next day, they met at a quiet cafe they used to visit together, though the nostalgia made him uncomfortable. Sophie walked in looking a bit different, her hair was shorter, and she wore an oversized sweater that seemed to swallow her. She looked vulnerable, even anxious, which threw him off. This wasn't the Sophie he remembered, the one who'd confidently walked away from him for his best friend. She sat down, eyes downcast, twisting her hands nervously. "Thank you for meeting me, Ethan. I know it's the last thing you want to do." He nodded, keeping his face neutral. "What's this about, Sophie?" She took a shaky breath. "Marcus and we didn't work out. It fell apart, and I realized that what I had with you was real in a way I didn't understand until it was too late." Ethan felt a surge of anger. So she was here because her backup plan didn't pan out? So you're here because things didn't work out with Marcus? His voice was sharper than he intended, but he didn't care. She flinched but held his gaze. No, that's not it. I needed to apologize. I was selfish, I was stupid, and I hurt you. I don't deserve anything from you, or not even forgiveness. But I thought you should know that I regret it. Every day, Ethan was silent, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and bitterness. He'd longed to hear her regret, but it didn't bring the relief he'd expected. Instead, it left him wondering what he'd do next and whether he could truly leave her in the past. Ethan left the cafe with his mind buzzing. Sophie's apology replayed in his head like a broken record. He'd imagined this conversation 100 times, thinking he'd feel vindicated if she ever admitted she was wrong. But instead, her words unsettled him, stirring up feelings he'd thought he'd buried. A few days later, another message popped up on his phone. Sophie, I know I don't deserve it, but could we talk again? There's more I want to say. I want to make things right. Ethan sighed, leaning back on his couch. Why couldn't she just let him move on? He thought about ignoring her message, but his curiosity overpowered his instinct to keep his distance. Against his better judgment, he agreed to meet up one last time. They met at a park near his apartment, somewhere public but quieter, without the intimate history that cafe held. Sophie looked more at ease this time, though her nervous energy still showed as she played with her necklace. He gave her a quick nod, waiting for her to start. I don't know how to say this without sounding selfish, but I've missed you, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Miss me? Ethan raised an eyebrow, his skepticism clear. You had Marcus. The two of you seemed perfectly happy. Sophie's face crumpled slightly. It wasn't what I thought it would be. Being with him, it was nothing like us. I was constantly comparing, constantly regretting. She took a deep breath. I made a huge mistake, Ethan. You were the person who made me feel grounded, who really knew me. With Marcus, it was all superficial. Ethan's stomach twisted as he listened. Part of him felt a pang of satisfaction at her regret, but a larger part of him couldn't shake the lingering hurt. And now that it didn't work out with him, you think you can just come back to me, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. She shook her head. It's not that simple. I know I can't undo the hurt I caused you. But I'd like a chance to prove that I've changed, that I've grown since then. He stared at her, trying to gauge her sincerity. Sophie, you shattered my trust. You didn't just choose someone else, you chose my best friend. And you didn't look back. A tear slipped down her cheek as she nodded. I know. I was impulsive and selfish, and I've paid for it every day since. I didn't realize what I was losing until it was gone. But Ethan, if there's any chance at all, even the smallest one, I'd like to try again. No pressure. Just think about it. Her words hung in the air, and he felt a mix of emotions flooding through him. He'd spent so long putting himself back together that the thought of letting her back in terrified him. But a small part of him, buried deep under layers of hurt, wanted to believe she'd changed. That maybe, somehow, they could recapture what they'd lost. He took a deep breath, steadying himself. I'll think about it, Sophie. But don't expect anything. I'm not sure I can go through that pain again. She nodded, her expression hopeful yet subdued. I understand. As he watched her walk away, he felt a weight settle over him. He knew he had a decision to make, and it would either open the door to something new, or finally close the chapter for good. Over the next week, Ethan was haunted by Sophie's words. He'd wanted closure, something to finally shut the door on the pain she'd caused. But instead, he found himself grappling with questions he thought he'd buried. Could she have really changed? And even if she had, could he ever trust her again? He sought advice from people who'd been there for him through the fallout. His friend Carla had been a rock, always reminding him of his worth when he felt crushed by Sophie's betrayal. They met up for lunch that Saturday, and she wasted no time getting straight to the point. Don't tell me you're actually considering this, she said, setting down her coffee with a look of disbelief. Ethan, she left you for your best friend. She didn't just cheat, she torched your whole support system. You were devastated, he nodded, rubbing his temples. I know, Carla. Trust me, I haven't forgotten a single detail. It was hell. But she sounded different. Like she really regretted it. She wants to prove herself. He paused, struggling to put his thoughts into words. I know it's probably a terrible idea, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel something. Some part of me misses who we were together. Carla's expression softened, but her voice was firm. Look, I get it. She was a huge part of your life. But that doesn't mean you owe her anything. She made her choices, and she knew what she was throwing away. As much as he wanted to brush Carla off, her words hit home. Ethan spent that night reflecting on what he truly wanted. He thought about the person he'd become since the breakup, stronger, more independent, and more cautious. And yet, Sophie's apology had chipped away at the protective walls he'd built, leaving him vulnerable once again. The next morning, Sophie texted him, asking if he'd made up his mind. His fingers hovered over his phone, uncertain of how to respond. He decided, finally, to be honest. Ethan, I still don't know if I can trust you. But maybe, we could try just as friends? No expectations. Her reply came instantly. Sophie, I'd like that. Just friends. They met up a few times after that, carefully navigating the boundaries of friendship. Sophie kept her word, never pushing for more, which surprised him. She listened when he talked, offering genuine empathy, and he found himself slowly softening. He even noticed how she'd changed in small ways, more thoughtful, less quick to jump to conclusions. But then came a moment that tested everything. They were walking in the park one afternoon, enjoying the crisp autumn air, when they spotted Marcus sitting on a bench with a group of mutual friends. Marcus caught sight of them, and his expression darkened. Ethan felt Sophie tense beside him, her fingers instinctively reaching for his arm. Ethan, she whispered, her voice strained. Do you want to leave? A strange calm settled over him. No. Let's just walk past. I don't owe him anything. As they walked by, Marcus muttered something under his breath, loud enough for Ethan to catch a piece of it. Guess some people can't resist sloppy seconds. Ethan stopped, feeling the anger flare up in him, but Sophie gently pulled him forward. He's not worth it, she murmured, her gaze steady. I learned that the hard way. In that moment, something inside Ethan shifted. He'd been waiting to see if Sophie would slip back into old habits or if she would show him she'd changed. This was it, the moment she could have let herself fall apart or lash out. Instead, she remained calm, her focus on Ethan rather than Marcus. They walked in silence until they were out of earshot. Finally, Sophie spoke, her voice soft. I'm sorry you had to go through that. I know I put you in this position. And I don't know if I'll ever be able to make it up to you. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the anger dissipate. Maybe you already have, he said, surprising himself. He hadn't expected forgiveness to feel so natural. As they parted ways that day, he realized something important. Forgiveness didn't mean he'd forget, nor did it guarantee a new beginning. But it meant he could finally let go of the past, whether or not they had a future together. Ethan spent the following days in a state of quiet introspection. He'd confronted his past with Sophie in a way he never thought possible, but it still left him feeling unsteady. He'd seen a version of her that seemed genuinely remorseful, willing to put his well-being before her own desire to reconnect, and yet, he couldn't ignore the years of pain she'd left behind. Even as her apology and gestures of friendship softened him, trust was a hurdle he couldn't seem to clear. One evening, he sat on his couch, Milo's head resting on his knee, as he stared at a message from Sophie on his phone. She'd texted a simple line, "Hope you're doing well. Take all the time you need." No pressure, no expectations, just a check-in that showed patience and understanding. For the first time, he saw a clear sign of the growth she'd promised. Feeling the need for advice, Ethan called Carla, who listened patiently as he poured out his doubts and lingering feelings. It's not that I'm even thinking of getting back with her, he said finally. It's more, wondering if I can fully forgive. Letting go, for good. Carla's voice softened. Forgiving her doesn't mean you're letting her back in. It means you're letting go of the weight you've been carrying. Maybe that's what you need to figure out, if holding on to this pain is keeping you from moving forward. Her words hit him hard. He realized that even with Sophie back in his life, he'd been clinging to the betrayal as a way to protect himself. But the bitterness had also kept him from fully embracing the life he'd started to rebuild. Maybe Carla was right, maybe forgiveness wasn't about Sophie at all, but about finding peace for himself. Taking a deep breath, he messaged Sophie, asking her to meet him one last time. When they met, he told her honestly, "I've come to realize that I can forgive you. Not because I want to start over, but because I need to let go of the past. It's something I need to do for myself." Sophie's eyes shimmered with relief, but she nodded, fully understanding. "Thank you, Ethan. That's all I ever wanted, for you to find peace." As they parted, Ethan felt a profound sense of closure. The past was behind him, and for the first time, he felt ready to embrace whatever the future held. Several months after his final conversation with Sophie, Ethan felt as if he'd stepped into a completely new chapter of his life. The weight he'd carried around, with the bitterness, resentment, and endless self-doubt, had finally lifted. It was like shedding an old skin, one he'd outgrown but had worn for too long. He couldn't pinpoint the exact moment he'd changed, but he knew that forgiving Sophie had given him back his freedom. With that realization, he threw himself into things he'd only half-heartedly attempted before, reconnecting with friends, focusing on his career, and even nurturing his passion for photography. One Saturday, as he strolled through the farmer's market, his camera slung over his shoulder, he noticed a woman examining a bouquet of flowers at a nearby stand. She was petite, with a cascade of dark curls and an open, easy smile that caught his attention. He found himself raising his camera, almost instinctively, and snapping a picture before he could think twice. She looked up, catching his eye, and grinned. "Photographer?" she asked, nodding toward his camera with a playful look. "Guilty," he replied, laughing. "I'm sorry, you just looked so, natural." "I didn't mean to intrude," she shrugged. "I don't mind. I'm Clara, by the way." She extended her hand, and he shook it, feeling a spark of connection that was as unexpected as it was comforting. They ended up spending the rest of the afternoon together, talking over coffee and wandering around the market. She had an easy laugh and an infectious curiosity about the world, reminding him of the simple joy of getting to know someone without expectations or baggage. Over the next few weeks, their connection deepened. Clara had a way of asking questions that made him open up, and before long, he found himself sharing stories he hadn't told anyone in years. He told her about his past with Sophie and the lessons he'd learned about trust, pain, and the resilience it took to rebuild after betrayal. She listened, not with judgment or pity, but with genuine empathy and understanding. One evening, as they watched the sunset from a rooftop garden in the city, Clara turned to him and said, "You know, you talk about Sophie like she's this ghost in your life. But you've moved on. You're not haunted anymore." Her words struck a chord, and he realized she was right. For the first time, he felt that his experiences with Sophie and Marcus were a part of his past, not his present. Ethan looked at Clara, recognizing the difference between what he'd felt for Sophie and what was blossoming here. His relationship with Sophie had been intense but flawed, built on shared dreams and memories that ultimately shattered under the weight of betrayal. But with Clara, he felt something that was entirely new, a sense of calm, of true companionship. He realized that, unlike with Sophie, there were no ghosts in his relationship with Clara. There was no past he had to overcome, no scars that colored his interactions. He felt free to be himself with her, without the hesitation or guardedness he'd felt before. She wasn't trying to fill a void or fix his pain, she simply saw him as he was, and she appreciated every piece of him, including the parts that were still healing. One night, as they walked hand in hand down a quiet street, he turned to her and said, "You know, meeting you made me realize something. Forgiving Sophie let me find peace, but meeting you helped me remember how to be happy." Clara smiled, squeezing his hand. "I think that's how it's supposed to be. We're all a little broken, but sometimes it takes finding someone who sees those cracks as part of what makes us whole." With Clara by his side, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. He'd been through heartbreak, betrayal, and the painful journey of forgiveness. Now, he felt ready to embrace the future, knowing that he was stronger and more resilient than ever. As they walked together under the soft glow of the streetlights, he realized he wasn't just moving on, he was finally, fully, living. And this time, he was doing it with an open heart and a clear mind, ready for whatever life had in store.
Thank you for watching this video. If you made it this far, please consider subscribing. I post stories like this on the regular. See you on the next one.